The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked sidewalks of Brooklyn as 73-year-old Margaret Williams slowly made her way home from the corner grocery store. Her weathered hands gripped two plastic bags filled with essentials: bread, milk, and the medication that kept her heart condition stable. Margaret had lived in this neighborhood for over 40 years, watching it transform from a close-knit community into something she barely recognized. Margaret's arthritis made every step painful, but she refused to let age defeat her spirit. She had raised 3 children in the small apartment she still called home, worked double shifts as a hospital cleaner for 30 years, and buried her husband of 51 years just 2 summers ago. Nothing had broken Margaret Williams yet, and she wasn't about to start giving up now as she approached the intersection of Atlantic Avenue and Franklin Street. Margaret noticed the commotion before she heard it. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Blue and red lights flashed against the windows of nearby buildings, creating an almost disco-like effect in the fading daylight. Margaret paused, her instincts telling her to wait and see what was happening before continuing her journey home. 3 police cruisers screeched to a halt just 50 feet from where Margaret stood. Officers jumped out with the kind of urgency that suggested they were chasing someone dangerous. Margaret squinted through her thick glasses, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding before her. She had always respected law enforcement, believing that most officers were good people trying to do a difficult job in challenging times. The officers seemed to be searching for someone, their heads turning left and right as they scanned the area. Margaret noticed they were all young men, probably no older than her youngest grandson. One officer, tall and muscular with a buzz cut, appeared to be in charge. He was barking orders at the others, pointing toward different areas of the street. Margaret decided to continue walking, figuring the police business had nothing to do with her. She had groceries that needed to be refrigerated, and her evening television programs would start soon. As she took her first careful step forward, her worn sneaker caught on a raised section of sidewalk that the city had never bothered to repair. The plastic bags flew from her hands as Margaret stumbled, their contents scattering across the concrete. Apples rolled into the street, her milk carton burst open, and the small bottle containing her heart medication bounced twice before coming to rest near a storm drain. Margaret herself fell hard onto her hands and knees, the rough concrete tearing through her thin dress and scraping her palms. The lead officer noticed the commotion and immediately assumed Margaret was somehow connected to whatever they were investigating. In the heat of the moment, with adrenaline pumping through his system, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Instead of offering assistance to an elderly woman who had clearly just had an accident, he saw a potential suspect trying to flee the scene. "Stop right there," the officer shouted, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Get on the ground and show me your hands." Margaret looked up in confusion, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead where she had struck the pavement. "I'm sorry, officer," she said in a shaky voice. "I just fell down. I was trying to get home with my groceries." The other officers quickly surrounded Margaret, their training kicking in despite the obvious misunderstanding. They had been told they were looking for a suspect in a robbery, and the combination of stress, poor communication, and split-second decision-making led them to view Margaret as a threat rather than a victim. "I said get on the ground," the lead officer repeated, his voice growing more aggressive. "Stop resisting and put your hands behind your head." Margaret tried to comply, but her arthritis made it nearly impossible to move quickly. The pain in her knees from the fall was excruciating, and she couldn't understand why these officers were treating her like a criminal. "Please," she whispered, "I haven't done anything wrong. I just want to go home." The situation escalated rapidly as the officers interpreted Margaret's slow movements as defiance. One of the younger policemen grabbed her arm roughly, causing her to cry out in pain. Margaret's medical alert bracelet, which clearly indicated her heart condition and age, swung visibly as they forced her arms behind her back. "This is unnecessary," Margaret pleaded, her voice breaking. "I'm an elderly woman." I fell down. "Please, you're hurting me." But the officers had committed to their course of action, and pride prevented them from admitting their mistake. The lead officer produced a pair of handcuffs while his colleagues held Margaret down against the concrete. The metal was cold against her wrists as they clicked into place, tight enough to cut off circulation in her already swollen hands. A small crowd began to gather, cell phones appearing as bystanders started recording the troubling scene. Margaret could hear voices of concern from people who recognized her from the neighborhood, but the officers seemed determined to follow through with what they had started. "Mrs. Williams," called out David Chun, who owned the corner market where Margaret shopped every week. "What are you doing to Mrs. Williams? She's 73 years old?" The officers ignored the protests from the growing crowd, radioing for backup as if they had successfully apprehended a dangerous criminal. Margaret's blood pressure was rising dangerously, and she could feel her heart racing in a way that terrified her. The medication she needed was somewhere on the ground among her scattered groceries, but there was no way to reach it. Meanwhile, just 6 blocks away, Mike Tyson was leaving a community center where he had been speaking to local youth about making positive choices. The former heavyweight champion had been working hard to give back to communities like this one, using his fame and resources to make a real difference in people's lives. His driver was preparing to take him to his next appointment when Tyson heard the commotion, the sound of sirens, and shouting drew his attention. But it was the crowd gathering around the police cars that made him tell his driver to pull over. Something about the scene didn't look right to Tyson, who had experienced his own difficult encounters with law enforcement over the years. His instincts told him that someone might need help. As Tyson approached the scene, he could see an elderly black woman on the ground, handcuffed and clearly in distress. The sight triggered something deep within him, memories of his own grandmother, who had been his anchor during the most difficult periods of his youth. This woman reminded him of all the strong elderly women in his community, who had shown him kindness when the world seemed determined to write him off. "Excuse me, officers," Tyson said in a calm but authoritative voice as he approached the group. "What seems to be the problem here?" The lead officer looked up, immediately recognizing the famous boxer. For a moment, he seemed uncertain about how to proceed. Having a celebrity witness to what was clearly becoming a public relations disaster was the last thing he needed. "Sir, this is police business," the officer replied, trying to maintain his authority. "I'm going to have to ask you to step back." Tyson looked down at Margaret, who was struggling to breathe properly. Her face was pale, and she appeared to be having some kind of medical episode. The boxer's protective instincts kicked in as he realized this woman needed immediate help, not arrest. "Officer, this lady looks like she needs medical attention," Tyson said, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being heard. "Are you sure you've got the right person?" The question hung in the air as the lead officer suddenly began to doubt his own actions. The crowd was growing larger, more phones were recording, and now Mike Tyson was questioning his judgment. For the first time since the incident began, he really looked at Margaret, her age, her injuries from the fall, her obvious distress. Margaret's breathing was becoming more labored, and she was starting to show signs of cardiac distress. The combination of physical trauma, emotional shock, and being separated from her medication was pushing her body beyond its limits. Time was running out, and everyone present was about to learn whether justice and compassion could prevail over pride and procedure. Mike Tyson knelt down beside Margaret, his massive frame somehow appearing gentle as he spoke to her in soft, reassuring tones. "Ma'am, my name is Mike. I'm going to make sure you're okay. Can you tell me your name?" Margaret's eyes fluttered open, focusing on the face of the famous boxer with confusion and relief. "Margaret," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Margaret Williams? I think I'm having heart problems." Tyson immediately turned to the officers, his demeanor shifting from gentle to commanding. "She needs an ambulance right now. And get those handcuffs off her immediately. Can't you see she's in medical distress?" The lead officer, Officer Rodriguez, found himself in an impossible situation. Admitting he had made a mistake would mean facing serious consequences, but continuing to treat an elderly woman having a medical emergency as a criminal was clearly wrong. The presence of cameras and Mike Tyson made backing down even more difficult. "Sir, we were responding to a robbery call," Rodriguez said defensively. The suspect was described as someone fleeing the scene on foot. "Does this look like your robbery suspect?" Tyson asked, gesturing toward Margaret's frail form. "This is someone's grandmother. She needs help, not handcuffs." David Chun, the store owner, pushed through the crowd carrying Margaret's scattered medication. "Officers, this is Mrs. Williams. She shops at my store every Tuesday and Friday for the past 15 years. She just bought groceries. Here's her heart medication that fell when you knocked her down." The evidence was overwhelming. But Officer Rodriguez's partner, a younger man named Officer Blake, was unwilling to let go of their original assumption. "How do we know she wasn't working with the actual robbery suspect? Maybe she was a lookout." Tyson's expression hardened as he heard this ridiculous suggestion. "Are you seriously suggesting that a 73-year-old woman with a heart condition was part of a robbery crew? Look at her. She can barely stand up." Margaret's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her lips were turning blue, and she was struggling to catch her breath. Tyson recognized the signs of a serious cardiac event from his years of training and staying in peak physical condition. He had seen enough medical emergencies in boxing to know when someone was in real danger. "I'm calling 911 myself," Tyson announced, pulling out his phone. "This woman needs immediate medical attention. And if you won't remove those handcuffs, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of officers you are." The crowd around them had grown to nearly 50 people, with multiple cameras recording every moment. News vans were starting to arrive as word spread through social media that Mike Tyson was confronting police officers over their treatment of an elderly woman. The story was going viral, and real-time. Officer Rodriguez finally realized that his career was about to be destroyed if he didn't change course immediately. The combination of public pressure, media attention, and Tyson's involvement had created a perfect storm that would end badly for everyone involved if he didn't act quickly. Okay, Rodriguez said, reaching for his keys. "Let's remove the restraints and get her medical attention." As the handcuffs came off, Margaret's wrists showed clear signs of injury where the metal had cut into her skin. Her hands were swollen and discolored, and she was unable to move her fingers properly. Tyson gently helped her sit up, supporting her back with one of his powerful arms. "The ambulance is on the way, Mrs. Williams," Tyson said softly. "Just breathe slowly and try to stay calm. You're going to be fine." Margaret looked up at her unexpected rescuer with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. "I don't understand why they did this to me. I was just trying to get home." The boxer's jaw clenched as he thought about what could have happened if he hadn't been there. How many other elderly people had been treated this way with no one around to advocate for them? The thought made him angry, but he channeled that anger into determination to make sure Margaret received proper care. Dr. Patricia Henderson, a physician who lived in the neighborhood, had heard the commotion and came to investigate. She immediately took charge of Margaret's medical care, checking her pulse and blood pressure while waiting for the ambulance to arrive. "Her heart rate is extremely elevated, and her blood pressure is dangerously high," Dr. Henderson announced loud enough for everyone to hear. "This woman is having a cardiac episode, possibly brought on by extreme stress and physical trauma." The words hit Officer Rodriguez like a punch to the gut. The realization that his actions might have caused a life-threatening medical emergency was overwhelming. He had joined the police force to protect and serve, not to terrorize innocent elderly women. "I'm sorry," Rodriguez said quietly, approaching Margaret and Tyson. "This was a mistake. A terrible mistake." Tyson looked at the officer with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Sorry doesn't fix what you did to her? Sorry doesn't take away her fear or heal her injuries. You need to do better than sorry." The ambulance arrived with sirens blaring, and paramedics immediately took over Margaret's care. They quickly assessed her condition and determined that she needed to be transported to the hospital immediately. Her vital signs were unstable, and the combination of physical and emotional trauma had pushed her into a dangerous medical situation. As the paramedics prepared Margaret for transport, She reached out and grabbed Tyson's hand with surprising strength. "Will you come with me?" she asked, her voice filled with fear. "I don't have anyone else." The request touched something deep in Tyson's heart. This woman, who had been treated so cruelly by people who were supposed to protect her, was now asking him, a stranger, to be her advocate and support system. It reminded him of his own grandmother's final days, when she had needed someone to fight for her dignity and care. "Of course," Tyson replied without hesitation. "I'll be right there with you, Mrs. Williams. You're not alone anymore." The boxer climbed into the ambulance, his large frame taking up considerable space in the small vehicle. But his presence seemed to calm Margaret immediately, and her vital signs began to stabilize slightly as the paramedics worked to address her. Conditioned as the ambulance pulled away from the scene, Officer Rodriguez stood among the scattered groceries and growing crowd of angry neighborhood residents. The weight of his mistake was beginning to sink in, and he knew that the consequences would extend far beyond this single incident. Captain Maria Santos, Rodriguez's supervisor, arrived on scene just as the ambulance disappeared around the corner. She had been monitoring the situation through social media and police radio, and she knew that her department was facing a public relations disaster of epic proportions. "What the hell happened here, Rodriguez?" Captain Santos demanded, her voice tight with anger and frustration. "Ma'am, we received a robbery call and thought the elderly woman was involved," Rodriguez explained, his voice shaking. "It turns out she was just walking home with groceries when she fell down." Captain Santos looked around at the crowd of angry residents. The news cameras and the evidence of what had clearly been a massive overreaction by her officers. The department had been working hard to rebuild trust with the community, and the single incident threatened to undo years of progress. "Did you verify her identity before placing her in restraints?" Santos asked, though she already knew the answer. "No, ma'am. We assumed she was fleeing the scene." "Did you consider that a 73-year-old woman might need medical assistance rather than arrest?" "Not at first, ma'am." Captain Santos closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to control her temper. She knew that this incident would require immediate action to prevent it from becoming a national scandal. The fact that Mike Tyson had intervened and was now at the hospital with the victim made the situation even more complicated. At Brooklyn Methodist Hospital, Margaret was rushed into the emergency department where a team of doctors and nurses immediately began working to stabilize her condition. The cardiac stress test revealed that she had indeed suffered a mild heart attack, likely triggered by the trauma and stress of her encounter with police. Tyson paced in the waiting room, making phone calls to ensure that Margaret would receive the best possible care. He contacted his personal physician, a renowned cardiologist, and arranged for him to consult on Margaret's case. Money was no object when it came to making sure she recovered fully. The media attention was intense, with news crews setting up outside the hospital and reporters trying to get statements from anyone who would talk. Social media was exploding with outrage over the treatment of Margaret Williams, and hashtags supporting her were trending nationwide. But inside the hospital, away from the cameras and crowds, two strangers had formed an unlikely bond. A former heavyweight champion and an elderly woman who had suffered an injustice were proving that human decency and compassion could still triumph over prejudice and abuse of power. 3 days after her hospital admission, Margaret Williams was finally stable enough to receive visitors beyond the medical staff and Mike Tyson, who had barely left her side since the incident. The boxing legend had arranged for a private room and round-the-clock nursing care, refusing to let Margaret worry about medical bills while she focused on recovery. The story had exploded across national media, with major news networks picking up the footage of police officers handcuffing an elderly woman while she suffered a medical emergency. The contrast between their actions and Mike Tyson's compassionate intervention had sparked conversations about police accountability and community responsibility across the country. Margaret's children had flown in from different states as soon as they heard about their mother's hospitalization. Her daughter Sandra, a nurse from Atlanta, was particularly grateful to Tyson for ensuring her mother received excellent medical care during those critical first hours. "Mr. Tyson, I don't know how to thank you," Sandra said, tears streaming down her face as she held her mother's hand. The doctor said if her cardiac episode had gone untreated much longer, we could have lost her. Tyson sat in the corner of the hospital room, looking uncomfortable with the praise. Your mother is a strong woman. She just needed someone to stand up for her when she couldn't stand up for herself. Margaret's youngest son, Robert, a lawyer from Chicago, was handling the legal implications of the incident. He had already been contacted by several civil rights organizations, offering to represent his mother in potential lawsuits against the police department. Mom, you don't have to make any decisions about legal action right now, Robert assured her. Just focus on getting better. But what those officers did to you was completely unacceptable, and they need to be held accountable. Meanwhile, the Brooklyn Police Department was in crisis mode. Officer Rodriguez had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation, and his partner, Officer Blake, was facing disciplinary action for his role in the incident. The department's reputation was taking a severe beating in the media and on social media platforms. Captain Santos held a press conference to address the incident, standing before a room full of reporters and cameras with the weight of the department's mistakes on her shoulders. The Brooklyn Police Department sincerely apologizes to Mrs. Margaret Williams and her family for the unacceptable treatment she received from our officers. Captain Santos began, her voice steady despite the difficult circumstances. We have launched a comprehensive investigation into this incident, and appropriate disciplinary action will be taken. A reporter raised her hand immediately. Captain Santos, how do you explain officers handcuffing a 73-year-old woman who was clearly having a medical emergency? There is no explanation that justifies what happened to Mrs. Williams, Santos replied honestly. Our officers failed to follow proper procedures, failed to assess the situation correctly, and failed to show basic human compassion. These failures are unacceptable and do not represent the values of our department. Another reporter pressed further. What changes will be implemented to prevent similar incidents in the future? Captain Santos had been preparing for this question. We are immediately implementing mandatory training on dealing with elderly residents and recognizing medical emergencies. Additionally, all officers will receive enhanced training on de-escalation techniques and proper suspect identification procedures. Back at the hospital, Margaret was slowly regaining her strength. The cardiac medication was stabilizing her heart rhythm, and the emotional support from Tyson and her family was helping her process the trauma of what had happened. I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been there, Margaret told Tyson during one of their quiet conversations. Those officers weren't listening to anything I said. Tyson nodded grimly. That's what bothers me the most. How many other people go through something like this with no one around to help them? We can't let this be forgotten once the news cameras go away. The boxer had been thinking deeply about the broader implications of Margaret's experience. His own struggles with the legal system had given him insight into how quickly situations could spiral out of control when people in authority positions made assumptions rather than gathering facts. Mrs. Williams, I want to do something more than just help with your medical bills, Tyson said, pulling his chair closer to her bed. I want to start a foundation that provides legal support and advocacy for elderly people who face situations like this. Would you help me with that? Margaret's eyes lit up despite her exhaustion. You would do that? We would do that together, Tyson corrected. Your experience, your voice, that's what would make people listen and create real change. The idea energized Margaret in a way that surprised her doctors. Having a purpose beyond just recovering from her ordeal gave her something positive to focus on during the difficult healing process. Dr. Jennifer Kim, Margaret's cardiologist, was amazed by her patient's resilience. Mrs. Williams, your recovery has been remarkable. The combination of proper medication, excellent nursing care, and strong emotional support has made all the difference. 2 weeks after the incident, Margaret was well enough to be discharged from the hospital. Tyson had arranged for her apartment to be equipped with medical alert devices and had hired a part-time caregiver to help with grocery shopping and household tasks during her recovery. The legal proceedings were moving forward as well. Robert Williams had filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against the police department, seeking damages for his mother's medical expenses, pain and suffering, and civil rights violations. The case was attracting attention from civil rights lawyers across the country. Officer Rodriguez, meanwhile, was struggling with the consequences of his actions. The internal investigation had found that he had violated multiple department policies, and he was facing termination from the force. More importantly, he was grappling with the guilt of having caused such harm to an innocent person. Against the advice of his lawyer and union representative, Rodriguez requested a meeting with Margaret to apologize personally. The meeting was arranged through lawyers, with Tyson present as Margaret's advocate and emotional support. The encounter took place in a conference room at Robert Williams' law firm, with lawyers for both sides present. Rodriguez entered the room looking haggard and remorseful, clearly bearing the weight of his mistakes. "Mrs. Williams," Rodriguez began, his voice shaking slightly, "I know that no apology can undo what I did to you. But I need you to know that I am truly, deeply sorry. What I did was wrong, and there's no excuse for it." Margaret studied the young officer's face, seeing genuine remorse in his eyes. "Officer Rodriguez, what you did to me was terrible. You hurt me physically and emotionally in ways that I'm still dealing with. But I can see that you're sorry, and that means something." The officer's eyes filled with tears. "I keep thinking about my own grandmother, and how I would feel if someone treated her the way I treated you. It makes me sick." "Then make sure it never happens again," Margaret said firmly. "Not to me, not to anyone's grandmother. Use this experience to become a better person and a better officer." The exchange was emotional and difficult, but it provided some measure of closure for both Margaret and Rodriguez. The officer would face criminal charges and lose his job, but he had also received something valuable: a chance to understand the human cost of his actions and to commit to doing better in the future. 3 months later, the Margaret Williams Foundation for Elderly Advocacy was officially launched at a press conference in Brooklyn. Margaret, fully recovered and stronger than ever, stood alongside Mike Tyson as they announced the organization's mission to provide legal support, emergency assistance, and advocacy for elderly people facing discrimination or abuse. "What happened to me should never happen to anyone," Margaret told the assembled media. "But if my experience can help protect other elderly people and hold those in authority accountable for their actions, then something good will have come from something terrible," Tyson added. "Mrs. Williams taught me that real strength isn't about how hard you can hit, it's about how you stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves." This foundation will be her legacy and our commitment to making sure elderly people are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. The police department settled Margaret's lawsuit for an undisclosed amount, which she donated entirely to the new foundation. Officer Rodriguez was criminally convicted of civil rights violations and served 6 months in jail, but he also became an advocate for police reform and worked with the foundation to develop better training programs. Margaret's story became a catalyst for broader discussions about police accountability, the treatment of elderly citizens, and the power of individual action to create social change. The unlikely friendship between a boxing legend and an elderly grandmother had proven that justice and compassion could prevail, even in the darkest circumstances. Years later, Margaret would often say that the worst day of her life had also led to the most meaningful work of her retirement. The foundation she helped create had assisted hundreds of elderly people facing similar situations, and the reforms implemented in police departments across the country had prevented countless